and the plot to destroy the Jews. Brother Russell.
Good evening, everyone. We're looking at the Bible, this message which it has for us today. And recently, this month, we've been considering the sections with regard to the end of the kingdom of Israel, the end of the kingdom of Judah, then the return from exile. And during that exile, we have the record of the book of Esther. Nebuchadnezzar it was who captured the city of Jerusalem, and he himself also was in turn saw his kingdom captured by others. This is a depiction here of the kingdom of Persia, the ancient kingdom of Persia. Perhaps see in the top right there, where it's placed there, top of Africa, Southeast Asia, recognise Greece, Egypt. So a very large territory here. And in the book of Esther it begins with these words. Came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. So a very large kingdom, much bigger than that which Nebuchadnezzar himself had ruled over. As we see there from the Indus River, all the way across into southeast Europe, and also, as we see, capturing the prosperous country of Egypt as well. Here is the suggested timeline of the Persian rulers taken from Daniel in chapter 11. We have Cyrus and Cambyses, Pseudo-Smerdis, Darius, Hystaspes, Xerxes, who was perhaps one of the most famous kings of Persia, having invaded Greece. And then we see it takes all the way down to Alexander the Great, focusing upon the first few kings there, as we can see. Our next chart shows us the Persian and Median royal houses. We can see here the way in which the two royal houses of these two kingdoms, which were very close to each other, they combined together, and the Persians and the Medians were in this way united. So we can see some of the kings came from the Median side and some from the Persian side, but we see them intermarrying and joining together. And we now call it particularly the Persian kingdom, the Medes, as it were, falling out of favour. Perhaps we might remember the terminology used in these scriptures. It's a bear with one side raised up above the other, giving its prominence to that particular part of the developing empire, the Persians. Here a suggestion is that Esther is married to this king here, and that her daughter, Queen, marries Darius. Different people identify Esther as marrying different people. Some say that Esther married this king here, Darius. Others, rather than her daughter, others that actually Esther married the next king, which was called Xerxes, the king who invaded Greece. So there's some debate and uncertainty amongst the historians as to exactly who this king Ahasuerus was. Here we have another chart. This one here, we might be able to read the writing. It's a little bit faint, so apologies there. It says the basis of rabbinical identities, real and fictitious. Okay, it says here some of the references from the Bible, and it talks about those which read in the Hebrew, Darius, even Artaxerxes, the implied identity holding from Ezra chapter 6 verse 14, and that's synchronizing with Nehemiah. So there's lots of attempts made to try and understand the way in which these passages interlink, and we'd think with Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, 3 books in the Bible, written over a reasonably short period of time, that matters would all have been decided, but it is actually one of the most disputed chronological periods in biblical times. So, there's reasons for this, as we can imagine. So, we might know something about the Jewish calendar. Here we see where we are now. The new year, Rosh Hashanah, started in September. We're now in this year here, Jewish year 5778. And it's a question then of the aspect of why is there a discrepancy in the Jewish dates? So there we have it, 5778 Anno Mundi, that's the year of the world, taken from the count down from creation in the Bible, equates with 2017-18 in the Common Era. So, why is there about 240 years difference? How has this arisen? Well, part of the difference is recognised as being in this Persian period. The Jews who lived through those times reckon it's 82 years shorter. They maintain that the length of the time of these rulers is inflated, therefore, of course. One of the main reasons for this inflation is Ptolemy's canon, which was written in the 2nd century AD, several hundred years after the period. The Jews were contemporary, as we say, they lived through these times. From internal Bible evidence, there's an issue with the chronology. This is nothing new. We've looked at this ourselves, we realise it's the case. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 25, it tells us that there's 7 weeks from the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem, not the temple but the city, and that equates to 49 years. So most chronologists have Cyrus in 536 before the Common Era, Nehemiah, who rebuilt the city, in 432. So it's 102 years. Of course, that doesn't quite fit, does it? So where does this leave us then? If there's uncertainty and ambiguity, should we be worried and concerned? Well, let's look at a Bible passage here in light of what it says in Daniel. Ezra chapter 6 and verse 14. It says there, "The elders of the Jews builded. They prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. They builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus and Darius, even Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month Adar, which is in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king." So we can see here, if we look at the Bible record, then this is the information which is given to us, inspired by the Holy Spirit, in order that we might have a correct understanding of such matters. So I think, if I'm not too far wrong, I think our brother in his last address had something very similar, if not the exact chart up here, which shows different phases here after the return from exile. Suggestion, this is where Esther fits in here during this period, before Ezra and Nehemiah. But we see this long period, 432, Cyrus, 536. However, when we consider Ezra chapter 3 verse 12, it says, many who were ancient men that had seen the first house wept. So when the temple was rebuilt here, in this period, then we need to bear in mind the temple was destroyed in 586 before the Common Era. So to Ezra, it was 128 years, plus whatever age they were when they saw the first temple. Yes, we know some people may live to that age, and they did, but it says many who were ancient men had seen the first house. So this seems to suggest that we need to pay attention quite carefully to the dates when we're looking at these things, in order to make sure that we are harmonising what these scriptures have to say. That is always our first port of call, surely. Here's a book. I do have a copy, but it's almost falling apart, so I didn't bring it with us. Instead, we have it here on the slide. It's called The Romance of Bible Chronology, treatise by Martin Anstey, as we might be able to work out the date here, 1913. It's in two parts, the treatise and the chronological tablets. I think you can get that on Amazon today. I'm not so sure about the first one, but the second one I think is commercially available. And his approach is to take the scriptural record as divine, the Bible records as paramount, and to regard secular chronology as needing to fit in with what the Bible says, rather than what lots of modern scholars do, is the other way round. So those who are not familiar with that, who are interested in the chronology of the period, he's got quite a lot to say on it, which seems to make sense as far as I can determine. Here we have a history of Iran, the modern name for Persia. We might recognise here, it's called here the Median Empire, the period in which we're talking about, 578 to that's 550, is it? Sounds a bit faint there. Hang on. What is this? Sorry. On the screen. So we can see this goes all the way back to thousands of years before the Common Era, BCE, all the way through to the modern times, to the Islamic Republic. Okay, so this is what we're talking about here, the period which we're looking at, the imperial period, when Persia was at its height in terms of its world domination. Persia itself centred around Persepolis. Its capital here is in the southern part of modern Iran. Okay, that's the country of Lydia, which is closely aligned with. Although it's a very mountainous region, the Median people were some of the first great cavalry people of the world. They invented trousers in order to ride on horses. We can see then something of the great extent of this 127 provinces which this king ruled over. So we're talking about the superpower of its day. Here again, starting in Persia, we see the various phases of conquest by Cyrus the Great, one of the most important leaders of Persia, taking over, as we see, all the way into Pakistan here, to the Indus River, all the way across into the Anatolia, into modern-day Turkey, and then conquering Lydia. You might know the story where the king of Lydia, a very rich and ancient empire, made a request at the oracle at Delphi, should he go to war against the Persians, and the oracle replied back, if you cross the river, a great empire will fall. And he did, and it was his own empire that fell, because of course it can be interpreted two ways. But a decisive victory was obtained, and the Lydian Empire here in western Turkey was absorbed into the Persian Empire. This is the territory here of ancient Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, now taken over by the Persians. And as we can see here, Cambyses conquered Egypt. Suggested date there, 525 BC. So, when we're talking about the book of Esther, we're talking about some aspects of history which are certain, some less so. But it is talking about important countries and a significant time in the history of the world. Here we have an illustration. It's comes down from those times, where we have the king seated, receiving his suppliants and his advisors, and this appears to be the queen also behind here, the queen veiled and standing behind. This is the Battle of Thermopylae. Xerxes we've mentioned in the place here, just to sort of show us something there of the interactions which were taking place. So, as we say, some say that Xerxes was this Ahasuerus, the king which Esther married. Some say that Xerxes was his son, and as we saw in that chart there, others that Xerxes was her grandson. It's about this sort of period. And Esther may have been alive at this time, even if she wasn't the ruling queen. Again, here this shows something of the way in which the power and might of the Persian Empire was depicted. Here is the lion taking on the bull, ravening him, and here we can see the various aspects of the servants, all under sway, vassals to the emperor of the Persians, the great king. The Persians, as we've seen, following on from Cyrus, were warrior kings. Ahasuerus is often regarded as a title, not a name, although, of course, titles can become names. And names can become titles, for that matter. Artaxerxes itself means, literally, the great king. So here we can see an artist's depiction of, I think that's supposed to be Cyrus. Here we see, again, it's come down from ancient times. This is the royal symbol of the Persians. You might recognise that from last week as well, which Brother Terrier brought to our attention. And here we have the king. And the king could not become a king until he had slain the lion. Okay, so this was part of their processes. So he had to go hunting and slay a lion in order to augment his position as the true ruler over the Persians and Medes. So, the king. I'm going to go with the suggestion it's Darius Hepstates. Okay. So what do we learn of him? If we go back to the book of Esther itself, in the first chapter and verse 10, we read, "On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zetha, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti before him." And then we see verse 13, "Then the king said to the wise men which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment, and next unto him was Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Merez, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat the first in the kingdom. And he said, What shall we do unto the queen Vashti, according to law, because she has not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains?" So, he's less of an autocrat, but he does divorce Vashti. And we can see, if we read the record, how he has a large number of concubines, as seems to be the wont of kings in those days. He took time. He did not rush into making a decision. So, as we say, he wasn't some necessarily vain autocrat. Verse 21 tells us, the saying pleased the king and the princes after he had received the counsel. The king did according to the word of Memucan, for he sent letters unto all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. He was, however, vengeful once slighted. If we go into the 7th chapter and verse 7, we see that the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereupon Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. The rule, as we may know from the prophecy of Daniel, was that once the kings of Media and Persia had made decree, it could not be altered. So what had to happen then was that another law has to come in to try and mitigate or circumvent the effects of the first. So here we see this, verse 8 of chapter 8. Write ye also for the Jews as it likes you, in the king's name. Seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. Verse 11. Wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together, to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. And so we see him acting in accordance with law, as we say, the unchangeable law of the Medes and the Persians. Once something was enacted, the only way to circumvent it was to bring in another law which mitigated its effects. He also seems to have run some form of meritocracy rather than merely being incestuous, as most kings are. We have, for instance, him elevating Haman, an Agagite, and Mordecai, a Jew, to positions of great prominence and significance within his reign. So it seems he was interested more in the merit of individuals rather than their providence. However, in the book of Esther, the God is not specifically mentioned. For this reason, some have questioned its canonicity, whether it's indeed an inspired book of the Bible. Suggestion is, however, that the king may be a type for God. He represents God in some way in the book itself. So here we have a famous inscription which has Darius the Great. You can see him elevated almost to the status of a giant here in front of his vassals brought before him. And we can see he has the foot here. You might be able to work that out. The raised up arms here of the captive, and we might be able to see he's got a bow in his hand. So we can see these kings always depicted as great military victors, great conquerors of the various nations over which he held sway, these 127 provinces. So here we have one of the sections here. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered. And this seems to be a theme in the book of Esther, that law, once given, cannot be amended and changed. Esther herself was fair and beautiful. Her name in Hebrew is Hadassah. Esther is the name that was given her. We don't know what she looked like, but as we can see, some people depicting her more in a sort of Western style, but she seems much more likely to be more Oriental in her appearance. But Beauty, of course, is individual, but certainly she was regarded, as the scriptures tell us, as both fair and beautiful. So, Esther the Queen, example of a faithful woman in difficult circumstances. In the Proverbs it tells us that beauty is vain. But of course, if we just trust in physical appearance, then of course we're undoubtedly going to go wrong. There's much more to an individual than that, as I'm sure we all recognise. She prepared herself for 12 months before being presented, so we can see the care and the diligence in which she applied herself to the task in hand. She was herself an orphan. Her mother and father had both died. She was adopted by her elder first cousin. She is regarded as his uncle's daughter, so they were first cousins, although he adopted her as her daughter, as his daughter, so he must have been older than her. Sometimes this happens, we know, in families where we have this generational age gap. So we have in the New Testament, regards to the aspect of adoption, something we shouldn't be unfamiliar with. The scriptures speak in such terms of those who embrace the Lord Jesus Christ. It says, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And so in a sense, we're all in this way part of an adopted family. So also in Romans chapter 8 and verse 15, Esther herself was adopted, a great example in this way. So we have here, we're told, reassuring us, you have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you've received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. Daddy, as it were, the cry of a youngster who has that affection for the parent. That's the way in which we should regard our adoption by the eternal. Where intelligent handling of delicate situation is manifest, going back to the book of Esther, in the 7th chapter there, we see this put into practice. Verse 3 tells us, Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favour in thy sight, O king, if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request, for we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue. Altogether, the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. So what she's saying is, if we were sold into slavery, I wouldn't have raised this petition. But our enemies want to kill us. What choice do I have? So there is hope for the destitute. An orphan rose to such greatness, becoming the queen of the world superpower at that day, and that a believer in the God of Israel. Here is a depiction of, some think, the crown of Esther. Then, of course, we have Mordecai, her first cousin, who was also her guardian, her adopted father. His name means little man. His genealogy is given in the first chapter, verse 5 and 6. We're told where he came from. It says there, it's chapter 2, not chapter 1, got that wrong. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. He had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. So he was a Benjaminite like Paul. And this also, of course, makes Esther a Benjaminite. He was loyal to the king. When he overheard two of the chamberlains discussing the assassination of the king, he reported them, and they were investigated and executed for treason. He was careful and cautious. We read here in the 10th verse here, He says, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Okay, so he cautioned her not to reveal her identity, but he himself made sure that she was okay by regularly visiting. So we can see his care and concern, his caution towards his charge. He believed in providence, although it's not directly attributed to God, as we have said. God is not mentioned specifically in the whole of the book. However, he himself was openly Jewish. He didn't hide his Jewishness. It was Esther, he had said, to hide her kindred, her family. So in the 3rd chapter it says, we read there, Now it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. So even though it antagonized this jealous individual, he was not fearful of the consequences. Ultimately, Mordecai advances in the favour of the king. The 9th chapter and verse 4, we read how Mordecai was great in the king's house. His fame went out throughout all the provinces, for this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. His integrity, his intelligence, his loyalty, all being rewarded here as he advanced in favour. In the 10th chapter and verse 3, we see how the book ends. Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people and speaking peace to all his seed. So, although God is not mentioned, we can see God's concerns with his people Israel and its necessity to have peace are Mordecai's concerns. And here's a depiction, artist's depiction, of course, of Mordecai overhearing the 2 chamberlains talking about assassinating the king. Here's another famous painting. This is Mordecai, dressed as we might recognise in more Turkish garb. This goes back into the Renaissance period. And this is Haman, who was forced to lead Mordecai through the streets, saying, this is how the king rewards the one in whom he delights. Something he wanted for himself, instead had to parade Haman about. Here is a depiction of Haman in the sackcloth and ashes, which, when he heard the decree, he put off his gorgeous apparel and humbled himself to petition. Presumably, of course, the implication is praying to God, but we're not told. And this is perhaps the most famous verse in the book of Esther. It's in the 4th chapter and verse 14 there, as we've highlighted. It's Mordecai answering Esther. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knows whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Words of somebody then who understands providence, one who understands that we are pawns in a much larger situation. And also that if our own efforts to perhaps do what we think is appropriate and right are frustrated, then ultimately that doesn't really matter, because others will arise who will be able to do this work, even if we don't manage to do it ourselves. Here's one then who trusts in the presiding power of providence. influence. Surely then, trusting in the God of Israel. In New Testament times, more directly, of course, God is referred to, but in the letter to the Romans, for instance, chapter 8, verse 28, perhaps a similar thought put in a different way. We know that all things work together for good, to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Here we have Haman the Agagite. He's an Amalekite, if we know that, those people from the Old Testament. They cursed Israel from ages past. They're called in the Bible the first of the Goyim, the first of the Gentiles. Not because necessarily they were the first people who came into existence, but they were the first people to attack Israel as a nation. They're under condemnation then for this iniquity. And in Deuteronomy chapter 25, we see that there was a curse, as it were, placed upon them. The 25th chapter of Deuteronomy, verse 17, where Moses speaking to the people tells them, "Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way, when you were come forth out of Egypt, how he met thee by the way, and smote the hindmost of thee, even all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary, and he feared not God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord thy God hath given thee rest from all thine enemies round about, in the land which the Lord thy God hath given thee for an inheritance to possess it, that thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Thou shalt not forget it." Haman himself was a man of selfish vanity. We'll see that when Mordecai refused to bow down to him, that he got upset. Not only this, verse 6 tells us, it wasn't just the individual he got angry with. It says, he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. And so, one man had upset him because he had refused to bow down to him, so he would kill the lot of them. You can see the sort of man this individual was. He was also superstitious. We read there in the 3rd chapter, in verse 7, in the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman, from day to day, from month to month, to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Doesn't mean that they sat there for almost a whole year casting lots, but actually they went through the calendar. So he could find his lucky day, where he could wreak his havoc. So we can see again the sort of person he was. He was looking for auspicious auguries to ensure the success of his persecution. The family also perished with him. Zeresh was his wife, and she didn't perish totally innocent in that way, of course. We wouldn't expect that, because, of course, we should, as the Bible tells us, we suffer for our own sins. We read here, "Then said Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends unto him, Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet." So, you can see the sort of advice his wife was giving him. The gallows, 50 cubits high. In the 7th chapter and verse 9, Abona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, "Behold also the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman hath made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, stands in the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him thereon." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. So we can see He is given to great ostentatious, dramatical representations here. Not just any old gallows, 50 cubits high. The tables were turned, as we have seen then. He was hanged, sadly, together with his 10 sons, on these gallows. At the time when the enemies of people of Israel were destroyed, in the palace itself, 500 men were killed in this at this time, when they had sought rather to destroy the Jews. The tables were very much turned upon them. What he thought to do to others, he brought on himself. When Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they hung the dead bodies up. Here is an artist's depiction here of Haman, here in the yellow, as it were, almost grabbing Esther the queen, petitioning her for his life because his foolishness had been revealed. The king returns, unhappy, and then they covered Haman's face. So we have the quick timeline of the book. In the first chapter, we're told that it was in the 3rd year of King Ahasuerus. He had a feast for 180 days. Yes, a feast for 180 days. This was an opulent time of great prosperity, when people weren't forced to eat and drink for this period, but everyone was left to their own devices. The king paid for it all. Don't get kings and rulers like that anymore, do we? In the 2nd chapter, we're told that after 12 months, that is in the 7th year of his reign, so we can see again, he didn't rush in immediately to find a new queen, but several years passed, and as we've said, Esther herself prepared for 12 months. Then we find that it comes to the 12th year of his reign before matters then continue to develop. So Esther has been queen now for some 5 years. It was in the 1st month, the month Nisan. It was the 13th day of the month, after he had cast the lot for his lucky day. So it took him less than a couple of weeks to make this fateful determination to exterminate the Jews for his hatred for one man. We read in the 5th chapter and verse 1 that Esther, having been commissioned by Mordecai, as we have seen that famous verse, that she should take action, because if she didn't, well, God would raise up and do the work through another. She waited to the 3rd day. So why the delay? Well, if we remember that the Passover is on the 15th of Nisan, then it would seem quite clearly she deliberately waited till after the Passover was finished, which was, of course, a time of celebration of the deliverance of the Jews. And now, of course, they had received this fateful declaration endorsed by the king that they're all going to be killed. And then in the 23rd day of the 3rd month, so afterwards, after Haman and his sons had been killed, Mordecai comes up with this counter plan. That is that before Haman's lucky day arrives, because it had been cemented in the laws of the Medes and Persians, that anyone who wanted could rise up and kill Jews, that the way this was circumvented was to introduce another law. That is, before this took place, anybody who was preparing to kill the Jews could themselves come under the prescription of the law. And the Jews, therefore, were entitled to rise up against them. Here again, another artist's depiction of the fateful scene. Naaman's plot exposed by the intelligence of this woman of faith. Here we have the point with regards to the height of Haman's gallows, 50 cubits, depending on what you regard the cubit. Let's take it the shortest measure, that's 18 inches, so that's 75 feet tall. This wasn't just a normal gallows, as we see depicted here on the right. Some suggest, as in the middle diagram then, it could have been more of a impaling rather than a hanging. The hanging does seem to fit, perhaps better. And here we have a Jewish depiction. You can see Haman here and his sons. And in the inspired Hebrew text, when we read the names of Haman's sons and their fate is ascribed to them, there in the 9th chapter, the names of the sons are actually all detailed, one under the other. So, as it were, giving this impression here that the great height of Naaman's gallows was used to display, sadly, the effects of those who've taken up this curse against God's people. So then, the book of Esther is associated then forever with the Feast of Purim, which we may have heard of. This is the celebration of God's deliverance at this time through the providential raising up of men of faith like Mordecai, women of faith like Esther. And this is what the celebration of Purim is. It's in the 12th month, the month Adar, that's the month before Passover, so had to wait almost a whole year after Haman had been killed, before the events were fully played out. To the Jews, Purim is a time of dressing up and special treats. It's a time of sending presents one to each other to remind themselves of their deliverance. And these are pictures which, of course, anybody can find on the internet, which perhaps illustrate these things. Little kids particularly like to dress up in fancy dress. This goes all the way back to the Persian Empire in the days of Esther, some 2,500 years ago. There have been other plots to exterminate the Jewish people. Here we have a depiction, of course, long time before days of Esther. The Pharaoh, king of Egypt here. The oppression of slavery in ancient Egypt, and of course the deliverance under Moses. Bible stories, I'm sure we all have some familiarity with. But again, the idea was to exterminate the Jewish people, even the people of Israel, even before they had become a nation, as it were. Here they were to be destroyed by Pharaoh because he was frightened and jealous of them. In more recent times, of course, others have taken up the cudgels against God's people. And sadly, it seems then that this fateful malaise to attack and exterminate God's people is sadly not unique to former times. Here we have the sad reminder of how these things are burned into our conscience in the 20th century. The Bible does, however, remind us, as we have seen there, that providence works. Let's read that section again. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knows whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The book of Esther reminds us that even an orphan can rise to greatness. Somebody who was adopted, somebody who was an exile in a foreign land, could rise to a position of critical importance and able to further a part, perhaps just a small part, or, like Esther, a major part in the unfolding purpose of God. We must put our trust in his providential hand, and trust also, as we see here, in the hope of Israel. The Old Testament ends here, prophecy of Malachi, 3rd chapter there, verse 6. I am the Lord, I change not. Therefore, ye sons of Jacob are not consumed. There is a message of deliverance in the book of Esther, which we can learn from today.